The last time we spoke, we talked about how there were some unanswered questions you had about biblical history and the significance of various symbols in biblical and Christian thought, and that you wanted to explore that theme through this Bible series that you had put together. And then you went ahead and you launched it to quite a bit of acclaim, is my understanding. So I'd be curious to know, did you gain any clarity through that process? What was it that you came to understand better or came to grips to through the process of researching and lecturing that material?
Well, I've wanted to do a lecture series on the psychological significance of the Bible for a long time, because in theory, the biblical writings are the foundational text for Western culture, for better or for worse, right? So, and you could make a case that in some sense they're functionally irrelevant, I suppose, or even harmful. That would be the case that the new atheist types would make, I would say. But that's not self-evident, and it's not all that intelligent, as they say, to throw the baby out with the bathwater. What I've found with biblical stories, the ones that I know well, which were mostly the stories in Genesis and the story of Moses and some of the New Testament stories, I knew them quite thoroughly, that the more I looked into them, the deeper they got, and that just never stopped. So that made me think. I mean, it's partly because of the structure of the Bible, which is intensely hyperlinked, because all the verses refer to all the other verses in some way. It's not that densely hyperlinked, but it's networked, kind of like a brain even. And so that's very interesting. It was the first really hyperlinked artifact, I suppose.
And when you say the Bible here, you're referring to the Old Testament and the New Testament?
Yeah, together. So, I mean, as something is written, you can refer back, but as it's edited, you can always also refer forward, and so the thing kind of ends up over a long time cohering into a whole of some sort.
And then that interpretation, if I understand correctly, kind of lies on the assumption that it is actually an edited text. It is assembled by human beings over a long period of time in a way that it does end up referring to itself because the people who are assembling it are conscious of what comes later.
Well, yeah, they're conscious of it, and it's influencing them unconsciously as well. And so however that book came into being is a very mysterious process, to say the least. So there's a variety of things about the lectures that are surprising from a, say, sociological point of view. The first is that they've all sold out, which is very striking and not predictable. The second is the attendees. They're mostly men between the ages of 20 and 40. And that is not what you'd expect.
That is not what I would have expected.
No,
that is surprising.
It is extremely surprising, yeah. And by mostly, I mean like 80% or 85%, like seriously mostly.
Wow.
And they're very attentive, like the atmosphere in the theater is very positive, but it's also quite emotionally charged. They're listening very seriously and asking very intelligent questions.
Yes, I was going to say a lot of that comes through in the question periods afterwards. You can hear how intensely people have thought their questions through, and how incisive they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And then online, well, the first lecture, which I think was called An Introduction to the Idea of God, has become my most popular online lecture, and it's got something approximating 850,000 views now, which is, well, again, a surprising number. And they've also been, the lecture series as a whole has also received a fair amount of attention from self-professed atheists those are often people who thought about religious issues and the clash between the religious viewpoint, say, and the modern viewpoint. And so they're thinking about it, they're wrestling with the ideas, and so they've found the approach that I've taken, which is fundamentally a psychological approach, illuminating. And then with regards to me, well, it's enabled me to deepen my understanding of the text substantially, and that's probably been, I was reasonably familiar with the first few stories in Genesis, the initial creation story, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, the flood, I got more insight into the Tower of Babel and what it meant. I mean, what it means in part is that things that are built too large to challenge God, let's say, to reach to heaven, are doomed to failure because they collapse from within. And that's unbelievable. That story is so prescient because it basically describes the danger of size, excess size, which I think is very wise. But also, it seems to me like a premonition of tyranny and ideological possession. You know, to build an earthly empire that's aimed at heaven, to establish a utopian scheme, is to risk dissolution and differentiation into multiple groups, that fragmentation into multiple groups that cannot speak to one another. You know, and I think you see some of that happening right now in the European Economic Community, for example, is that one of the problems with it is that it's probably too big and it fractionates because it can't tolerate the internal stress. So
how is it that people in you know, barely historical, almost prehistorical human history that are just coming together into large societies, essentially, in terms of, if you look at our history as a species, I mean, it's really just at the cusp of our, when I assume that these stories were coming together, it's sort of at the cusp of our collection into these city-state units. How is it that something like that, something that profound, would have occurred to these people? Like, is there a way that you can account for, like...
I think the same question applies to the Egyptians, you know, when they came up with the story of Osiris and Set. You know, they had this idea that the state was represented, could be well represented by the figure of a paternal god, a patriarchal god, let's say Osiris. And they characterized him as old and willfully blind and constantly menaced by the machinations of his evil brother, who he didn't take sufficiently seriously. And like, that's so brilliant. The idea that, well, a state collapses because it turns a blind eye to its twin shadow, essentially, and then at a moment of weakness, that power-hungry shadow reaches forward and takes control, and then produces the dissolution of the state. You know, and then Horus has to come back from the underworld, essentially, and defeat Set and reestablish the kingdom by giving Osiris his eye. It's crazily brilliant.
I remember the first time you told me that account, actually, in our first interview, and my mind was sort of blown for weeks afterwards, because just the sheer insight of the symbology is really incredible, which leads me to question, because my mind tends to go this way. I mean, I tend to try to map it onto what was actually happening physically in these societies at these times, just because I'm curious about it. It's an unknown period in terms of how people were living their day-to-day existence, and we can only gain glimpses of it through archaeology and textual inquiry and that sort of thing. So I wonder, it seems like these lessons must have been deeply learned, or at least represented symbolically so well that they must have reflected some sort of lived experience.
Well,
societally.
I would think so. I think what was happening with the Egyptians was that they were sufficiently organized as a society to start to experience the detrimental consequences of organization. And that was a new thing. Like in the Mesopotamian story, which I believe is older, there's not much indication of the danger of the state per se. The danger is mostly fragmentation of the state and the terrible catastrophes of the natural world and the unknown. But by the Egyptian stories, there's a definite, clear apprehension of the potential danger of the tyrannical state. And you know, Egypt lasted a long time. It was thousands of years, far longer than any of our modern societies have lasted.
Precisely, that often sort of haunts me, actually, that perspective.
And so, you know, God only knows what the collective vision of the people dreamed up. I mean, these stories were, well, they're revelations of a sort, in that they're unconscious productions. And you know, we don't know the reach of the unconscious mind. The symbol creating mind is a very strange entity. You know, and Jung, of course, when he talked about the collective unconscious, he did that most particularly in his book Ion, which is a study of astrological symbolism across 3,000 years, essentially. It's a terrifying book, because Jung was convinced that ideas, you know, have motive force that last millennia. Well, that's why he called it ion, and that they unfold in prophetic ways. That's one way of thinking about it. In
what do you
ways
mean
that,
by prophetic in this context?
well, it's as if the symbol creating part of our mind, which is detecting patterns all the time, can what infer from those patterns likely future developments and project them. So for Jung, the astrological world was a projection of the interior psychological world onto the unknown space of the skies. So you look out in the sky and you don't know what's up there, and you're trying to figure it out, right? Because you know it's associated with the seasons and there's some regularity to it, but you have no idea what's there, and so what you do is imagine what might be there. And so it's a place that dreams can be projected, and that's how he regarded astrology, was as the projection of the interior psychic underlay onto the cosmos.
I suppose it is sort of the ultimate projection screen in that sense, right?
Well, and how else? I mean, his point was, well, how else could it be? Obviously, people explore the unknown with their imagination. And to the degree that they don't understand the unknown, what they're looking at is their imagination. And, you know, the sky is obviously associated with the progression of time. And the astrologers knew that. They were astronomers as well. Obviously, none of that had been differentiated. And so they were imagining the transformation of the world across time, and the march of the I don't have the technical terminology right, but I believe it's the precession of the equinoxes. It's something like that. The sky isn't a static entity, and so they're dreaming about what was and what is and what could be. And for Jung, and I think he was absolutely right about this, that the dream played the same role in the development of the psyche as art plays in the development of the culture. Like, artists are the people who dream culture into being. And
it's a pre-conscious representation of what's already been experienced, as we've talked about.
That's right. It's a pre-articulate representation, right? Yeah,
right.
It's like a bridge
maybe
between...
verge of consciousness, but pre-articulate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's the bridge between what we absolutely don't know and what we know well enough to articulate and act out. Something has to fill that gap, and that's what the dream does, and that's what art does.
So here's a question that often occurs to me. I don't have a clear answer to. I'm just curious what you think. So if that's the case, let's say the cosmos, or the stars, essentially, that's a fairly blank canvas onto which people could project the various anima in their psyche, and from Jung's perspective, that reflects what's going on internally. In biblical stories, but also in stories from other cultures, ancient stories like the ancient Vedic tradition, or all the various First Nations creation stories, there must be some degree to which they're reflecting back, as with the Egyptians, an aspect of sort of cumulated lived experience on the social level. And they're reflecting back the lessons that they've learned.
Yes, well, and also on the biological level. I mean, you know, there's good study published recently showing that 6-month-old infants, I think it was 6 months, are already showing fear of snakes and spiders, and that's before they've been exposed to them. So there's been an argument about among psychologists for a long time whether fears were only learned, that would be the behavioral perspective, whether you're prepared to learn certain fears, which is sort of a mediator between the behavioral perspective and perspective that takes into account inherited structures, or whether they're actually innate. And the evidence keeps accruing that some of these fundamental fears are innate. And that's a very strange thing. Because
more hardware than firmware, if we follow that
exactly. Well, and
metaphor.
And I mean, the archetypes, the symbolic representations we have, say, of reptilian predators, dragon in particular, are very, very deep. The dragon is a symbol that you find everywhere in the world. There was a good book written about that recently, actually. The guy who wrote the book, whose name I can't remember, unfortunately, thought that a dragon was a cat-snake bird. And so because the major predators of tree-dwelling primates are predatory cats, snakes, and raptors.
Right, and keyword there is in my opinion, in the way I'm interpreting it, is tree dwelling. Like that's how far back
right,
this
60
goes.
million years at least. Yeah.
So on that, so
at least 60 million years. It could be longer than that. But snakes and human beings, snakes and the ancestors of human beings co-evolved, and Lynn Isbell has demonstrated that down in, she's a scientist in the California state system. I think she's at UCLA, and she was very interested in why human beings have such acute vision, and so she did a study looking at the relationship between acuity of primate vision and presence of predatory snakes, and found a pretty powerful relationship. And we can really detect snake-like camouflage patterns, particularly in the lower half of our visual field. And so, yeah, these things are, see, the way it looks to me is that we developed this predator detection system, right? What's in the unknown? A predator. What's the predator? It's a cat snake bird, which is exactly what it is, right? And you think, well, that's not a category. Yes, it is. It's a low resolution category it's the same category as predator.
That's right. From a cognitive anthropological perspective, which is sort of, again, the way I just tend to look towards things, it's actually the most functional category.
Absolutely. It
right?
contains all the relevant elements.
That's right. If it's more differentiated, then you have to make the assumption that you all automatically know what's about to attack you, which you don't, because it's the unknown.
That's right. So it's a cat snake bird, and it breathes fire. And, that could be a reference to a poisonous snake, but it also could be the inclusion of fire in the dangers. Because, of course, fire, well, it's certainly a danger on the veldt, it's certainly a danger in the forests. And so fire-breathing cat snake bird covers a lot of territory. But it's even better than that, because you say, well, what's in the unknown? So you project the contents of your imagination into the unknown to fill it. But the thing is that we're not just prey animals, we're also predatory and exploratory. And so the dragon, the cat snake bird that breathes fire, isn't only a predator, it's also the thing that guards virgins and the thing that guards gold. And that's also fascinating, because I think that the ancestral males who were good at keeping the cat snake bird at bay were much more likely to propagate. I mean, that just seems self-evident. I think when you tell people that, everyone thinks, well, obviously. And that's the gladiatorial type, or maybe the person who went out and found out where the nests of these things were and got rid of the nests. And so we have this bifurcated image of the predator, which is the predator / unknown, which is also the place of new useful things. And so, but it's very, what would you call it? It's very articulated, almost. Like in the Mesopotamian story, one of the names for Marduk, who goes out and confronts Tiamat, who's basically a cat snake bird, is he who makes ingenious things out of the body of Tiamat. And I mean, how can you can't get any more direct illustration of the idea than that. And when he has battles with Tiamat, who's come back with all the monsters there are, including the king of evil at their forefront to destroy the society of the gods, he cuts her into pieces and makes the world. And so that's perfect. That's the savior of humanity, let's say, is he who confronts the chaotic unknown, differentiates it, and makes the habitable world. It's like, and one other thing I figured out about that is the Mesopotamian Marduk, so he's the model for the emperor, also makes human beings out of the blood of Kingu, and Kingu is the worst of the monsters that Tiamat breeds when she comes to take out the gods, because they're making too much racket. And that's a precursor of another idea that's unbelievably complex. It took me a long time to figure this out. So, in the Christian tradition, the serpent in the Garden of Eden, so that's the unknown thing that beckons and that enlightens you if you interact with it, although it also extracts a cost. So it's the thing that doesn't belong. And it's a snake. But in the Christian symbolic world, the snake is Satan. You think, what the hell? What the hell? Why is there a relationship between the snake and Satan? It's such a leap. It's almost incomprehensible. But it's a matter of abstraction. It's like, well, the snake is a bad thing. It's a snake, and it'll eat you, and it'll eat your children, and it'll bite you. Like, it's pretty self-evidently bad. But if you talk about archetypal bad, well, then what happens? Well, what happens is you use the same cognitive systems to represent bad at all levels of bad.
Right, exactly. So it makes sense, as it would in a dream, that our cognitive circuitry draws upon the same connections and thus the same imagery when it's instantiated.
It has to, because we're,
that's right. That's the language that it's speaking to
yes,
itself.
well, and you know how evolution works. It's conservative. And so we use the old circuitry that helped us detect the cat snake bird to represent the unknown as such, but also to represent malevolence as such. And so then you say, well, what's malevolence? It's the snake, but then it's the snake in society among people. So then the snake might be the foreigner. And then, well, then it's the snake who's your brother. And then when it gets completely abstracted, it's the snake that lives in your heart, right? And then that's evil as such. And then that's a personality, because evil as such manifests itself as a personality. And so that's what Satan is the eternal personality of evil. And that's associated with the snake. It's unbelievably brilliant.
So here's a question then. If the snake plays such a central role in Christian or even Judeo-Christian Abrahamic tradition, what about the role that it plays, or different symbols that are used to represent the same sort of neural circuitry in other cultures? Like, is there any particular reason that we should be paying more attention or special attention to the biblical tradition as opposed to the plethora of other traditions around the world that have existed throughout time?
Not necessarily. The problem is that it's not easy to get into those traditions. You know, I mean, because...
As a Westerner.
Yes, exactly, because the tradition isn't only the stories, it's also the rituals, and it's also the culture. And, you know, you can't just jump into that and understand it. You know, like Western people say very frequently that, well, they say, I'm a Buddhist. It's like, actually, no, you're not a Buddhist.
In what sense?
Well, because it's not just a set of beliefs. It's not a set of propositions about the world. It's not a set of ethical propositions. It's an entire culture. It's the literature of the culture, it's the rituals of the culture, it's the unspoken customs of the culture. Like, it's not something that you can abstract intellectually, move, and then transplant into a different system. It
seems that that's a very sociological, not that it's inherently right or wrong, it just seems that that's a very sociological reading of what religion is, or what belief is, as opposed to sort of a textual understanding.
Yes, definitely.
And that's intentional on your part. Like that's your understanding of what belief is. It's the actual actions that people engage in as well as the text. Is that fair?
Well, and certainly the actions that are beyond their understanding. And so those are the cultural codes in part. I mean, look, yoga has been transplanted to the West, but it's been completely transmuted. It's really become, in some sense, a set of physical exercises for people to stay in physical shape. Like, it hasn't been divorced from its underlying spirituality completely, but it's been divorced a lot from it, so it's been secularized in a sense. It's not easy to transplant these things. And so the reason that I'm delving into the biblical texts, say, as opposed to other texts, is that, well, that's the foundational text of our culture, and it's like I'm wearing it already in some sense, even though I don't know it. I mean, I knew all the stories vaguely, you know.
Did you go to Sunday school as a child?
Yes. So, I mean, I'm familiar with the stories. But you got to start somewhere, so you might as well start with your own culture, because you're a manifestation of that culture, and so is your culture. So, you know, there are harmonies between the stories and what you are. And so one of the phenomena that people describe to me very frequently is that they listen to the lectures and they come up and they say, well, it's as if you're telling me all the things that I already knew. And that's like Plato's remembering as the manner in which you accrue knowledge. And the idea of remembering, you know, because the Platonic idea was something like, before you're born you know everything, and then when you're born you forget it, and then as you go through life you remember it. And, you know, there's some real truth in that, especially given these findings say that such things as snake fear and spider fear are innate, because the ground for what you're going to experience and remember is already in place. And, like, look, there's been some really interesting developments in neurology recently as the resolution of scanners increases. So
yes, I saw a journal article that I think you referred to on your Twitter account recently, if I'm not mistaken, about attention. Right? Is this where we're?
Well,
where
it's partly that. It's partly that so your brain, the neurons aren't connected randomly in some sense. So first of all, the neurons are in columns. So the units of connections aren't neurons; they're pre-assembled packages of neurons, which are part of the fundamental replicated architecture of the cortex. So it's like imagine a millipede. It's got all those legs, but it's the same genetic structure that codes for all the legs. It just adds units of genetic structure to code for more legs.
Oh, interesting. So you're talking about the physical structure,
of
physical
the brain.
neuronal structure.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's in these columns, and those columns are pre-assembled packages of neurons. But more than that, so you know, neurons that fire together wire together. That's the Hebbian notion. But more than that, underlying the cortical columns are these superhighways of tracks that are already in place, and they're almost structured in a cubic manner. They're lined up, and so you already have superhighways that predispose certain kinds of neurons to connect. Right? So the tracks are already laid down, and then at the end of the tracks, it's something like they grow up to specific neurons, and so that's where the experience does the modification.
And the implication here is that evolution as a conservative process has laid these tracks for millions and millions of years, so that there's a
pre-organization,
a potential towards a certain direction, so that we hit the ground ready. In
exactly that, and it's flexible in that if part of your brain is damaged, another part can take over. So there's redundancy built into it. And so that's part of what makes it confusing, because, you know, if you let's say you have intractable epilepsy when you're a young child, it's like seriously intractable, and they do a hemispherectomy, which is pretty dramatic, right? It's like half your cortex is gone. Well, if you do it young enough, the other cortex will take over all of the functions. Now, it gets a lot more active than it would be otherwise, and it's also more, and then if it's damaged, of course, it's going to be harder for you to recover. But there's a lot of plasticity, so that's confusing. But the brain has optimized itself so that there's pre-existing structure and plasticity in the case of damage.
Exactly. Yeah.
But that pre-existing structure, I read that in Kurzweil's relatively new book called, I think it's called How to Make a Mind. That's very close to what it's called anyways. And I thought, oh, well, there's the archetypal structures right there. I mean, they're built into the lower parts of the brain anyways, like down where the snake fear is.
Right.
But the fact that the cortex has these superhighways already in place, that is archetypal structure.
So as an hypothesis then, if that's the case, if we were to hypothesize that these neuronal superstructures or primary structures map onto archetype or archetypal symbology, would we expect to find commonalities across cultural traditions?
Sure.
that map directly onto those underlying?
Yes, exactly. Well, and you certainly do. I mean, the dragon image is one that's particularly common, but it's not the only one that's common. So, I mean, obviously the image of the mother is common, and
certainly. But to what degree has that been? I mean, I'm asking genuinely. I don't know, because I haven't read. I suppose it would be anthropological or psychological or archaeological literature somewhere in the nexus of those three. But do we know to what degree, for instance, the archetypes that Jung identified really do resonate across cultures versus whether it was a study of the archetypes in Western civilization?
Good. No, I don't think we do know, except I think the farthest we've got on that is with investigations into snake fear. So and that does seem to be biological, right? It seems to be instantiating. You say, well, that's not that crucial. It's like, yeah, actually, it is that crucial. It depends on, well, it also depends on whether it's actually snake fear. You see, because I think it might be toothed reptile fear or something like that. It might even be toothed underwater reptile fear. You know,
toothed underwater catbird.
Yeah, well,
fear.
right, exactly,
Yes.
exactly. So certainly snakes will activate that circuit, but that doesn't mean that they're the only thing that will activate the circuit. So my suspicions are that, I mean, who knows? But I suspect that infants might also be susceptible to, like, teeth with blood, for example.
Just as you say that, of course, I have this, as a human being, I have this
Right.
initial sort of recoiling reaction.
Right.
I would imagine that's fairly universal.
Yes, yes, you would think so. Right, right. And so the full range of what might constitute universal representations of the predatory unknown aren't mapped out, and people have studied snakes per se, but you know, it isn't exactly clear that it's, I think snakes are a manifestation of the cat snake bird, and that what we're really wired to be afraid of is that. And
what about other characters that you would see in other traditions, even if you and I aren't personally as familiar with them as people in those other traditions, but for instance the trickster figure, or other sort of anthropomorphized or sometimes animated in terms of like an animal often represents these things, right?
Well, I think the trickster figure that's relatively straightforward. I mean, one of the things that's peculiar about human infants, I think, is how early they develop a sense of humor. Like, it's really remarkable because there's some weak evidence, I suppose, that other animals have a sense of humor, but it's pretty, I mean, the evidence isn't great.
It seems to us that at least apes, when we see them interacting, we project that they're laughing at each other or having jokes. But I guess there's no real way to know in the sense that we are projecting.
Well, they do have proto-behaviors that are humor, like they bare their teeth and they make noises that are vaguely reminiscent of laughter, but it's not like they tell each other jokes. It's not like they do things that are funny for each other or any of that. I mean, that just doesn't happen. Now, you know, it's conceivable that if an ape falls flat on its face, that there's a dominance hierarchy reaction to that, you know, which is to bare the teeth and to look predatory, something like that. And maybe that's part of the proto-development of a sense of humor. I'm
going to watch slapstick comedy in a completely new way now.
So, but human infants develop a sense of humor unbelievably early, like, and the smiling is part of the social bonding, but, and little kids are tremendously funny. Like, they get it. They get jokes really early, and they act out jokes and play tricks, like, very, very early. And so the trickster figure is associated with this human sense of humor, which is incredibly well developed and universal, absolutely universal. And then it doesn't take much to also draw a link between humor and truth, because there's something in humor that's, well, first of all, often what people who are funny do is tell you a truth that no one else will state. Stand-up comics do that all the time. And then there's the idea that, you know, if you're telling a joke, you're in somehow simultaneously beneath and above contempt. Like, it's a bad sign not to be able to take a joke, even at your expense. And I think the reason for that is that, you know, let's say you're about to do something important and you trip a little bit, and so you kind of lower yourself, and, you know, you laugh and other people laugh. And what you're indicating is that you can accept the fact that you're imperfect. And so what you do when you accept that fact is you simultaneously elevate yourself, because you say, well, I'm clearly the thing that can make the mistake, but I'm also clearly the thing that can recognize the mistake and put it in its proper context and transcend it simultaneously, which is exactly what someone who can take a joke does.
Which is an indication of status as opposed to the inverse. Right?
Well, it's an indication of the existence of the thing that produces status. That's that capacity for transcendence. So that's why, in some sense, the fool or the trickster is the precursor to the savior. Because there's wisdom, there's real wisdom in that ability to, you think, I'm laughing at myself. It's like, that's a very strange statement. It's because you're dividing yourself into two parts there. It's the fool part, that's the thing you're laughing at, and there's the thing that's laughing. And you're privileging the thing that's laughing, and the thing that's laughing is the thing that can take the joke and move on. And people admire that, as they should, because it's an indication of your ability to transcend, well, to transcend your foolish limitations. And so the idea, it's very likely that the idea of the trickster will emerge, because the humorist is always on the cusp of between foolishness and wisdom, always. That's the right place for them. That's what stand-up comics do. You can just watch them. They're like, I saw Bill Cosby at one point in in Edmonton, Alberta, 30 years ago or so, and he just came out with a cigar and sat on a stool, and he told truthful stories about his family. You know, he had a good edge on them, and certainly included himself in the joke, but people in the audience were hysterical. The guy in front of me was laughing so hard that his wife had to keep elbowing him. I thought he was going to pass out. But all he did was sit and tell insightful, satirical stories about himself and his family. You know, and people love that. And that's why comedians are sort of canaries in the coal mine. You know, there was a comedian in Quebec a year or two who was charged by the Ontario, or by the Quebec Human Rights Commission, which I thought was a very bad thing, because if you can't tolerate, it's tyrants who can't tolerate the comedian. And that's like the jester in the king's court, right? He's beneath and above contempt at the same time. He can goose the king or the queen. You don't get to cut off his head, because it's beneath you to do that. And that also means that the jester is the only person who can tell the truth. So
there's almost like an ecological role for that being in a society that is hierarchical.
Definitely, yeah. It's an indication. Well, it takes the tension out of the hierarchy. It points out the foibles of the powerful, and it simultaneously signals the existence of the thing that can transcend frailty. It's really important. So
to bring this back to the biblical theme that we were discussing earlier, to what degree is my reading has been quite cursory, but to what degree do you think the prophet figures in the story of the people of Israel in the Bible represent a figure like that, in the sense that they're able to come forward and say, you know, this is where we're misstepping? They don't often seem very comedic.
No,
they seem
don't.
Very dark.
No, yes, definitely.
But is there an overlap there? How should we understand
those
figures in the text?
The comedians are better at doing that with a light touch. You know, they're not so heavy and dark.
That light touch does seem to be missing in the Old Testament.
Yes, it does. It does. Although there are comedic elements, like I think the element in the Adam and Eve story, after Eve has given Adam the apple and Adam hides behind a bush, which is kind of comical to begin with. It's like, really, that's the best you can do? It's like it's God you're hiding from. The whole bush thing, that's not going to cover you up very well. And then immediately Adam, when he's called out on his behavior, immediately points the finger at Eve and, you know, says, this woman that you made me, she's the cause of all the trouble. It's dark, but it's also got a comedic element. Although, and of course the entire structure of the Bible is a comedy rather than a tragedy, because a comedy has a happy ending. So, but no, it's not a book noted for its humor. The prophetic figures are more, they're just one side of the trickster, I would say, because they definitely point the way to, they point at error and danger, but it's pretty dark and dramatic, and they put themselves at risk. And so I don't know exactly why the biblical stories have less of that comedic element.
I'm going on a limb here, but my understanding from just some of the research I've been doing over this past summer in the course of putting together this other interview series that I was working on, is that the current, and this may well change as there are new archaeological and textual revelations, but the current understanding, even though people who are deeply religious in the sense of believing the literal text may be hesitant to absorb, my understanding from speaking to archaeologists and others is that it seems as if the biblical text as we have it today, and when I say the biblical text, I'm referring here to the Old Testament, it seems as if it's actually a cobbling together of stories of disparate tribes to create an overarching nation-building narrative for political purposes.
Sure.
So if that's the case, if it was more if the act of at least assembling it, if not the origin of the stories, but the act of assembling the stories into a particular format was a political act, an act of power consolidation, as much as it was a representation of these as we talked about, sort of a pre-conscious symbology, it wouldn't be surprising that it would sort of lack humor.
Well,
that those would be edited out.
The first thing is that there's no difference between assembling stories and consolidating people, tribes. That's the same thing.
Right.
Right, because each of the tribes has a story, and when you bring them together, the stories have to be assembled together and unified, or the society isn't unified. It's as simple, like we're struggling with that right now. The entire issue of Islamic migration into the West is exactly that problem. It's like, how do we build a mediating structure between these two narratives? And the answer might be, well, one side wipes the other side out. Well, that's not a bridge exactly. The alternative to that is that some kind of narrative understanding emerges, and you know, that can take a very long period of time.
Could that not take a religious form?
Which it has to, by definition, it has to take a religious form, because the stories, those fundamental stories are religious. Now, you know, people may say, well, they're not religious. It's like, well, it depends on what you mean by that. You don't have a choice about whether or not you're religious. You can state that you don't believe in a transcendent deity. You can state that you don't believe in symbolic representations, but they structure your perceptions, and they structure your actions, and they structure your ethics. And so it doesn't matter how much you say that. It's like, then okay, there's a critical part of your verbal consciousness that rejects the substructure, but that's not very helpful. It still leaves you between a rock and a hard place. That's why the atheists that I talked about earlier are so attracted to the biblical story analysis that I've been producing, because they're stuck with this substructure, and they're just a house divided amongst itself without being able to mediate between their conscious representation of the world and the underlying structure that is actually them and their culture. So, and then you said, well, is it political? Is it a matter of power? Well, no, because political isn't, if political is a matter of power, that means it's failed. Like a tyrannical state is a failed state, because you have to use force to keep it together. And so that
But if you look at the vast history of humanity, like if you go back to the Egyptians, who you said, you know, were around far longer than we've been around as Western civilization, were they not tyrannies in the modern sense of our understanding?
Well, the answer would be yes and no, you know, because there's, even with a monarchy, there's degrees of tyranny. But remember, these old structures were also based on an underlying religious reality. Like if you were a Mesopotamian emperor, for example, you actually had obligations. Well, and this is what's what the patriarchs in the kings in the Old Testament are constantly being reminded of. The prophets come up and say, look, you're king, and you think that means you're absolute, but you're not absolute. You're subject to whatever constitutes universal ethical morality. And so you're subject to the will of God, let's say.
Just as you say this, I can't help but think how this is reflected directly in politics today in the United States, as I literally saw in the news yesterday. I mean, it's just amazing how perennial this is.
Yes, well, it has to be, you see, because part of what God is in the Old Testament is the abstraction of the idea of moral authority. And so moral authority doesn't adhere in the king. The king only has moral authority insofar as he's acting out moral authority as such. So, for example, with the Mesopotamians, when you were emperor, you had to be Marduk. You had to be the force that confronted chaos and made order. And you were reminded of that every New Year's, because you were brought out of the city into the chaos, and you reenacted the conflict with statues. That's what they used the statues for, was to reenact the conflict between Marduk and Tiamat. And you were supposed to, as an emperor, you're supposed to do that successfully. And you were required, in a sense, to, what would you say? To confess to all of your sins that year, if you were the ruler, and repent of them. And your sins were a listing of the ways in which you hadn't been a good, attentive Marduk. Now, Marduk had eyes all the way around his head, and his words were magic. He paid attention, and he could win in the conflict with the great cat snake bird and keep everything safe. And so tyranny is deviation from that. And the king had a moral obligation. I mean, part of what human beings have been recognizing across the millennia is that the good ruler acts out the archetype of the good ruler. It isn't arbitrary. And Frans de Waal has already found evidence for this in chimpanzees. So, for example, he's shown that chimpanzee tyrants have unstable regimes. So if it's the biggest, ugliest, meanest chimp who's at the top of the hierarchy and he's only there because of ferociousness and physical domination, then, you know, that can happen. But the troop is very nervous and unstable, and as soon as he has a bad day, two subordinates who are bonded because they're capable of reciprocal interaction take him out. And the more stable chimp leaders, let's say, are pro-social, not power mad.
It certainly is an argument for a power-sharing equilibrium, in that it's more stable, and the society itself will likely flourish longer. And
well,
is it not equally possible, though, that you can have tyrannical equilibria, that you may take a different set of tools to keep them enforced, but nonetheless they can persist for a remarkable amount of time?
Not archetypally, because archetypally, that's the king that devours his son, or that's Osiris without Horus. Is that if the tyranny is absolute, the state becomes static, and then as the underlying environment changes, which it will, there's no force that enables innovation, and so the thing collapses. Now it's like, you know, what you're asking in some sense is, isn't it the case that order can prevail? And the answer to that is, well, yes, order is necessary, but as soon as it becomes absolute order, which is essentially absolute tyranny, then the state becomes so rigid that it can't withstand any environmental transformations. It's as if all the variability has been forced out of the system.
Right,
and
but
so,
may that not only be tested in a circumstance in which the environment suddenly does change?
Well, I think that is when it's tested, but it always happens. The environment always does suddenly change. So, well, anyways, our experience with this has been sufficient so that the stories always point to the same thing, which is that there's a dynamic element that has to be preserved in the order, or the order will collapse. And that dynamic element, well, one of the arguments I've been putting forth in the biblical series is that's basically the idea of the Logos in the West. The Logos is the dynamic element that revitalizes the state. Now, you know, in Christianity, that's embodied, incarnated, represented in the figure of Christ. But in the Old Testament, it's represented in the figure of the great prophets and people like Noah as well, right? The great heroes. And you asked me what I had learned in part from doing the biblical series, and I learned a variety of things. Like, it's been a classic Christian contention that the Old Testament God is rather harsh and judgmental and isn't transformed into the God of love until the New Testament. But I was taken to task by one of my Jewish friends that was kind of Northrop Frye's vision too, for falling into that idea too uncritically. And one of the things I have learned from studying the stories of Abraham, for example, and Isaac and Jacob, is that the Old Testament God can definitely be negotiated with. And the other thing that's very interesting is that the main figures in the stories, especially after Noah, become increasingly differentiated, genuine individuals. They have very complex lives. They're not simply good by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, Abraham himself doesn't leave his father's house till he's like, I think he's 84 or some ridiculous thing, you know, so when God calls him to get the hell out and have a life. And I'm also struck by the serious realism of the stories. Like, so Abraham he's lounging around home where it's comfortable for way too long, and God finally kicks him out. And so that's like the call to adventure from a mythological perspective, right? And you might think of it as the following of the Spirit that takes you out of your father's home into the world. You think, well, is that God? Well, that's how it's represented in the Old Testament. It's like, well, if it's not God, well, what is it that calls you forward? It's something. So, and God is sort of unnameable anyways in the Old Testament, but God is the force that calls you out of your father's house into the unknown. Hey, that's not a bad hypothesis. Well, what Abraham encounters first is famine, and then and he goes to escape the famine, and then he ends up in a tyranny where people are trying to take his wife. It's like, it's so interesting because God calls him forward and offers him all this promise, and the first things he encounters are just absolute bloody catastrophes. It's no picnic. The stories are unbelievably deep and realistic, and the characters extraordinarily flawed and complex, and the story of their relationship with divinity extremely realistic and mysterious. So it's Jacob that wrestles with an angel or with God, and Israel means he who wrestles with God, which I think I read that just blew me away. I thought, because I'm trying to figure out what belief in the Old Testament means, you know, because modern people think that belief means your conscious assent to a set of propositions. And that isn't how it is in the Old Testament.
Well, that's certainly a Christian conception, but
yes.
in other traditions, in Judaism and to some degree Islam, but in more legalistic traditions, there's a much more blurred line between belief and orthodox practice.
Right.
You can act something out and be a good Jew or a good Muslim, even if you haven't opened your heart to your prophet of choice.
Yeah, well,
right, which doesn't map onto to my understanding of the Christian tradition very well at all.
Well, it also depends on which brand of the Christian tradition, because that would be more the having to act it out part would be more true of Orthodox Christianity and less true of Western Christianity. So I mean,
post-Reformation.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so I mean, I think that to a large degree, this was also part of Nietzsche's criticism of Western Christianity, is that there wasn't enough stress laid on the acting out of, say, Christ's example, and there was too much stress laid on the justification by spoken assent, something like that, because the idea is, well, if you say the words that indicate, I guess that's the Nicene Creed, that you believe in the resurrection of Christ, then that's sufficient to save you, something like that. And Nietzsche criticized that because, well, his perspective was, well, no, that sacrifices the imitation of Christ, and that's what it's all about.
From a sociological perspective, though, is that not perhaps a mechanism that was devised to, and when I say devised, I don't necessarily mean intentionally, but that arose in order to unite an increasingly large and diverse number of people, uniting many city-states under the rubric of a holy Christian empire, whereas previously you had traditions that were much more tribal.
Well, this is the thing, is that all of these things, and many of the things that the Catholic Church are blamed for, are those, they're decisions that are advantageous and disadvantageous at the same time. Like I've been looking into the idea of, so there's no justification by works in Western Christianity, not much anyways. So,
what is, can you?
Well, it means that doing good things on earth isn't what saves you in heaven. Okay, and why? You think, why? What the hell? Why would you come up with that? Well, here's why, in part, is like one of the ideas that was emerging as Christianity developed was that, the commoner and the king, in some sense, had equal sacred worth. Now, the evidence that they didn't have equal worth was that the king was really rich and successful, and the commoner was just like a loser peasant. And so, on the face of it, it seems like the king is being blessed by God for his... I mean, that's the evidence that he's blessed by God. And so the Christian reaction to that was, no, you can't use earthly success as an indication of heavenly favor. And then that sort of, well...
From a cynical perspective, isn't that because then the whole structure would fall apart? Because then people would be confronted with their servitude and say, well, wait a minute, this doesn't, the jig would be up. This doesn't mesh.
Well, I would say that's part of the Marxist criticism of that particular perspective.
Right. But there may be something to be said from that angle.
There is,
right?
There is. Well, that's why I said
it doesn't have to be Marxist. It could be Marx might have actually hit on something useful there.
Oh, well, fair enough. But that's why I said each of these approaches have their advantages and their disadvantages. I mean,
but they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, are they?
No. And advantages and disadvantages are almost never mutually exclusive. It's like, because you don't get a benefit without paying a price for it. It's always that. And so anyways, back to the power issue. It's like when these stories were assembled, you could say, well, they were all assembled for the purposes of power. But I don't think it's the right way of thinking about it, because first of all, it takes a very long time for the stories to be assembled and transformed into something that's coherent again. It happens across hundreds or even thousands of years. So it's not like there's any directing individual force that you could identify with power per se. Now,
there is a theory in the biblical context, from my understanding. I don't know how it would necessarily be definitively proven or disproven, but that when the Bible as we know it, the Old Testament as we know it, was assembled, it was actually an act of Babylonian Jews being returned to the Holy Land by their Persian overlords, essentially, and told, hey, get these people together and rule this area in a coherent manner. And to do so, they had to come up with a narrative, and in so doing, actively collated these stories into one coherent text.
I think there is active collation, you know. But the thing is the other thing that's so interesting about that is that the active collation has to work. So let me give you a modern example. So I have a friend who's a comic book writer, and he took on the job of writing comic book figures like the Wolverine or the Hulk that already had a well-developed mythos. And you might say, well, the artist can take that in any direction he wants, and the answer is no, he can't. Because
not if you take the fanboys into account.
And you do, because they're your customer base. And so you have to develop the mythos in a manner that's acceptable to the community. And so if you collate these stories together, you have to do it in a way that doesn't provoke rebellion. And there aren't very many ways to do that. That has to be acceptable, let's say, to the majority, such that peace will reign.
Right.
So
it's a dance in that sense.
It is, absolutely. It's a continual dance between the people who are doing the editing and the people who are doing the listening. And it's not like we've stopped doing that. The dialogues that are continually going on between people of different religious faiths now, or even between religious people and atheists, are part of that attempt to continue to integrate the narrative, because without the integrated narrative, which we act out because it's also a drama, we're fractious and at war. So, but it's not just power's the wrong way to think about it. The better way to think about it is that it's an attempt to bring about something like an equilibrated state that people will, in the Piagetian sense, that people will voluntarily participate in. So, which means you have to take their tradition sufficiently into account. Now, if you look at Marduk, you know, he's got like 50 names. And you think, well, what does that mean? That's easy, is that each of those names was the name of one of the sub-deities, tribal sub-deities that were brought under the hierarchical representation of Marduk. So he's an amalgam of the primary deities of all the tribes that united to form Mesopotamia.
And you can see shadows of that, I suppose, in the biblical tradition as well, right? There are different names of the early god.
Right, exactly.
In the plural versus the singular versus, you know, various monikers that he has, which does suggest there were different tribal traditions.
Exactly. Well, and there's two different creation stories melded together at the beginning of Genesis.
Which is incredibly difficult to explain unless you view it from this perspective that we're talking about, where you had different tribal narratives being united into one overarching narrative for, if not for power purposes, for at least the purposes of social unity.
Yeah.
So something.
Well, it's also a reasonable thing. Like, it isn't something that you lose by admitting, I think, if you're religiously minded, because, you know, if you say that what's happening in the collation of the biblical narratives is an attempt to distill wisdom, which I think, what else is it? I mean, obviously that's what it is. I mean, unless you can't even be cynical about that, because you could say, well, no, it's the opiate of the masses, say from the Marxist perspective. It's like you have to posit a conspirator for that, and then it's a conspirator that's working over thousands of years. It's like, sorry, that just doesn't hold water. No one can be a tyrant over thousands of years. It doesn't even make any sense. So something's driving the collation. Now, like, you could say, well, the wisdom isn't perfectly collated because people are imperfect. It's like, yeah, absolutely. But that doesn't mean there's nothing to the core. And I mean, you see that, I think you see that with the continual emergence of the prophets in the Old Testament, because they all basically do the same thing. The king emerges, deviates from the proper ethical course. The prophet, who's insanely brave, stands up and says, look, you don't get it. You don't understand that if you deviate from the central moral law, all hell will break loose. And the fact that your king is completely irrelevant. It will also break loose for you. And then the kings generally ignore the prophets, and then, you know, it's servitude for the Jews, or they're half wiped out, or, you know, or there's a flood. I mean, I know that doesn't happen with Noah's a prophet. He tells everyone there's going to be a flood, so no one listens. So
just before we take a brief pause to switch batteries, so one other theme that's continual as well as the prophet theme through the Old Testament aspect of, or section of the biblical tradition, is this notion of the instantiation of the holy in a people and in a land, which, when Christianity comes around, sort of explodes or fragments or evaporates or gets sublimated, one might argue, from a Christian perspective, not from a Jewish one, but from a Christian one. So I'd like to follow up on that thought just after we take a break and switch back.
That's a good one. We'll definitely do that.
Hi guys, Jordan here from Behind the Lens at Transliminal Media. Thanks for watching. Peterson's a great guest, and I hope you like the interview. I love being able to provide you guys with this kind of thought-provoking content, so I just wanted to take a minute to overcome my own camera shyness, basically, and tell you a bit about my plans. At the moment, recording these interviews is a labor of love, but I have hopes to do a lot more and create multiple streams of seriously good content for you guys, my viewers and listeners. From devil's advocate style hot seat debates with big names, to in-depth conversations like this one, to interviews with cutting-edge investigative journalists and researchers. I want to share with you guys my passion for learning, for investigation, and especially for real, free, and open dialogue across ideological lines, without concern for political correctness, virtue signaling, or pandering. Now, here's where I swallow my pride and tell you I'm self-employed, and any time spent working on this really good stuff is time not spent earning essentially the basic income I need to live. So my pitch is this. If each one of you signs up as a patron on my Patreon account to share even just $1, one single dollar per video or podcast, I'll be able to put a whole lot more time towards this stuff and create for you guys the kind of mind-expanding material I know you'll enjoy and want to watch and rewatch over and over. Not only that, but my patrons get early access to the full-length, raw, unedited interviews. They can participate in polls about what or whom I should focus on next, and even pitch new interview ideas to me directly. I want to hear from you guys. So come join the Transliminal community, and let's make some quality content people will be watching and listening to for a long time to come. Patreon.com/transliminal.